Asia, Middle East, and Latin America. The First World War's impact on national trends. Great Britain and France made promises to win the support of populations living in their colonial holdings. Suggestions of nationalism were made to the Syrians, Jews, and other Arab identities. Unrest in India forced the British to establish new policies of self-governing to calm tensions. Following the war, the nationalist ideas were hard to toss away. Many colonial identities felt betrayed by the Allied forces. Following the war, the European nations tried to increase political and economic dominion over their colonies. Mandates were placed over Germany's former colonies in the dissected Ottoman Empire. These territories were identified as regions where people existed who could not govern themselves. The Permanent Mandates Commission was established by the League of Nations to observe the European nations' responsibility toward their mandated regions. Soviet communists denounced what they called European and American imperialism and supported revolutionary movements in colonial territories. Nationalism provided an organizational motivation to withstand imperialist governments. It created a foundation for change and challenged political and social practices. Nationalism accepted the concepts of modernization of a society, which would eventually improve education and economic viability. The fearful side of nationalism centered on a we versus they concept of political and social identity. This created conflicts between groups of people. Conflicts developed between homogeneous groups such as Irish against British or Japanese against Chinese. Religion and ethnicity became a focus of tension between groups. Muslims against Hindu in India or Greek against Albanian in the Balkans were created by religious or ethnic tension. Nationalist movements in the Middle East. Arab populations under the Ottoman Empire were under a greater level of understanding of each other due to the common bonds of Islamic faith. However, ethnic tensions between Turks and Arabs simmered below the social surface. Turks promoted a form of Turkish nationalism and brutally massacred the Armenian Christians. Over 1 million Armenians were killed by Muslim Turks. Arabs who opposed Ottoman rule allied with the British, who suggested nationalist possibilities after an Allied victory over Germany and the Ottomans. The Arabs felt betrayed by the Sykes-Picot Agreement between Great Britain and France that sectioned apart the Arab lands of Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, and southern Turkey. The Balfour Declaration made by Great Britain to the Jewish nationalists stood in conflict with promises made to Arab identities. Arab nationalists met at Damascus as the General Syrian Congress and unsuccessfully called for political independence. Western imperialism replaced Ottoman rule. The new governmental system in Turkey was British imperialism. Italy and Greece both claimed shares of the Ottoman territories. Mustafa Kemal was a Turkish military man, sympathetic with the Young Turk movement. He began organizing Turkish resistance against British rule. Greeks and Turks became embattled over territorial control. The Turks won a victory at Ankara, and the Greeks sued for peace. The Treaty of Lausanne recognized an independent Turkey. Mustafa Kemal wanted a modernized and secularized Turkey, formed on the lines of the Western governmental powers. The Sultan was deposed, and a republic was established. Islamic powers were limited, and a separation of mosque and state was established. State schools replaced religious schools in which math was more important than religious history. Women were given the right to vote. Civil law, rather than Islamic law, governed marital bonds. Mustafa Kemal was granted the surname of Ataturk by the National Assembly, which meant father of the Turks. Persia was renamed Iran in 1935. Britain and Russia had divided Persia prior to World War I. The British portion was along the Persian Gulf. The Russians controlled the north. After the Bolshevik Revolution, British troops quickly occupied the north, filling in the empty political gap and keeping the Bolsheviks out of the region. Reza Shah Pahlavi was brought to power by the British authorities. His goal was to modernize Iran, free it from foreign domination, and to rule it with an iron fist. Iran was a vast, underdeveloped nation with a large rural population that was mostly illiterate and very poor. Among the poor were ethnic identities who dreamed of their own national sovereignty. The Shah created a modern army, built railroads, and encouraged commerce. He gained control over the Kurds in the north and the Arabs along the Iraq border. The religious leaders who turned against him were severely punished. In Afghanistan, the anti-British Emir Amanullah declared holy war against Britain and won independence. The Emir then established policies to try to move his primitive country into the modern world. Faisal bin Hussein, who was deposed in Syria, was placed as the new king in British-controlled Iraq. He allowed the British behind-the-scenes political control and granted British ownership of the Iraqi oil fields. He gained support from the people and moderated independence from Great Britain with the promise of a long-term military alliance. Egypt had been occupied by Great Britain since the late 1800s. British authority announced Egyptian independence, but maintained military control in the country. They agreed to restrict the British military bases to the Suez Canal zone. The French identified Lebanon as an ethnic enclave. France played the policy of divide and rule, pitting ethnic and religious minorities against each other. A small Jewish community remained in Palestine ever since the diaspora during the ancient days of Roman rule. Zionist movements gained momentum in Europe under the direction of Theodor Herzl, who professed the only real location for a Jewish state was in Palestine. However, the greater number of Jewish immigrants headed for the United States instead of Palestine. Jewish migration to Palestine increased following World War I and rapidly increased during the 1930s as persecution of the Jews in Germany was well underway. Jews in Palestine purchased land from wealthy Arabs who were absentee owners. The absentee Arab owners were indifferent with the poor Arab tenants and did not concern themselves with their welfare. However, most Jews were from European cities and preferred to live in new cities, such as Tel Aviv. The British responded to Arab pressure and slowed down the flood of Jewish immigrants. Great Britain proposed an independent Palestine with the number of Jews permanently limited. Zionists considered this as a move toward losing the dream of a Zionist state. Toward self-rule in India. When World War I started, the British feared a revolt in India. Instead, the Indian forces supported the British war effort. In return, the British opened more quality jobs to Indian citizens. During the war, India suffered from inflation, high taxes, food shortages, and an influenza epidemic. Indian nationalist movements gained momentum, and moderates and radicals in the Indian National Congress joined forces. They created the Lucknow Pact, which created an alliance between the Hindus of the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League. British response was confused. They established a dual administration, part Indian and elected, part British and authoritarian. Indians were to handle uncontroversial issues such as agriculture or health, and the British were to handle issues such as taxes, police, and the court systems. Authoritarian rule undermined the reforms in the Indian government, and unrest developed. The British answer was the establishment of the Rowlatt Acts that extended wartime governmental policies. This created confusion that led to the Amritsar massacre. Mohandas Gandhi was born in British-controlled India. He studied law in England and returned to India. He represented the case of Indian merchants in the colony of Natal in South Africa. Discriminatory laws had been passed against the Indian merchants. Gandhi took up their legal defense and was almost lynched by an angry mob. His defense of the merchants made him the respected leader of the Indian population throughout South Africa. When immigration restrictions against Asians were established, Gandhi organized nonviolent protests that withstood beatings, arrests, and imprisonment. By 1914, many of the Indian demands were met. The discriminatory taxes on Indian traders were abolished. Non-Christian marriages were recognized, and Indian immigration was allowed to continue. Gandhi's South African experience inspired his campaign of nonviolent resistance to British rule in India. Boycotts were established against British goods, jobs, and honors. Peasants were told not to pay taxes. Both the elite Indian and the poor illiterate began to follow the directions of Gandhi. Some turned to violence and riots broke out. Immediately, Gandhi called off the campaign. He was arrested for the violence and told the British judge that he was mistaken to believe the Indians would accept nonviolent measures. After being released from prison, Gandhi set up a commune, established a newspaper, and began to reform Indian society to improve the lot of the poor. He welcomed the untouchables, worked to help child widows, and promoted cottage industry. Resentment of British rule continued to increase as the British continued their efforts against Indian independence. Gandhi continued a hard line, but maintained a nonviolent method. After a series of protests, boycotts, and arrests, the British were willing to sit with Gandhi and discuss a new constitution. Indians were given a voice in British Indian administration. Although Gandhi was able to gain respect with the British authority, he was unable to settle the growing divide between the Hindu and Muslim sections of India. Hindu and Muslim atrocities continued and only ended with partition of the nation. The new country of Pakistan was established. Nationalist struggles in East and Southeast Asia. Yang Xingge was the central revolutionary figure in China. He betrayed the Manchu leaders and convinced the revolutionaries he could unite China. He concentrated on building his own power after he was elected president of the republic, dissolved the government, and ruled as a dictator. Following Yuan's death, the Chinese government nearly collapsed and a multitude of local military leaders shared power. Japan's expansion into Shandong and southern Manchuria during World War I enraged China's young patriots. They became furious when Japan was allowed to remain in China's territory after the war. Japan's occupation of the region led to the Chinese movement against foreign imperialists, which was identified as the May 4th movement. The core ideology of the movement was pro-Marxist. Sun Yat-sen decided to ally his nationalist party, the Guomindang, with the communists to create a liberation front. Sun planned on using the Nationalist Party to crush the warlords and reunite China, but died unexpectedly. Chiang Kai-shek took his place. The tense relationship between the Nationalist Party and the Communists turned violent as the Communists tried to overthrow the Nationalists. Chiang Kai-shek decided to purge the leftists, forcing the Communists into hiding. The new cultural movement attacked traditional Chinese culture and promoted Western educated thought. The intellectuals stood against ancient Confucian thought and promoted a simpler written language and mass education. The Western culture and education the new cultural movement was considering was Marxism, which to the Chinese was a Western thought. Mao Zedong recognized the potential of controlling the Chinese peasants and leading them into revolutionary directions. Mao began his revolutionary career as a labor organizer. He first used peasant revolt in the autumn harvest uprising, but was not successful. The communists continued to build up supporters and centered their control out of Renjing, where they entrenched against nationalist attacks. The intellectual revolution created changes for the Chinese population. Foot binding was outlawed, arranged marriages and polygamy declined, educational opportunities opened for Chinese women. The Meiji reformers were successful in creating a strong Japanese nationalistic state. A modern industrial society had developed, the only one throughout Asia. Japan considered itself to be the protector of Asia, and returned parts of the Shandong Peninsula to China. These types of moves reduced tension in East Asia. A growing population created problems for the Japanese government. The country had few natural resources and had to import most of its food. This made Japan vulnerable to every up or downswing of the international market. Japanese leaders saw colonial expansion as international prestige and a form of national defense. They gained control of Korea, Taiwan, and Manchuria to create a defensive ring to protect their island nation. Financial oligarchy developed that put the power in the hands of a few. Japanese corporations became zaibatsu, or financial combines. The company had control of multiple business entities, employed thousands of workers, and dominated the economy. Japanese ultranationalists despised anything Western or Marxist. They believed in the concept of Asia for the Asians. Ultranationalists were noisy and violent in the 1920s. The Great Depression of the 1930s, which hit Japan particularly hard, helped them gain power. The rise of Chinese nationalism was a challenge to Japanese control of Manchuria. The Kuomintang unified China and concerned the Japanese military. The Japanese manufactured an excuse for military action and had Japanese railroad tracks blown up near the city of Shenyang. The Japanese sent in reinforcements and occupied all of Manchuria. Japan built steel mills and heavy industry in Manchuria to supply the vital military needs. Japan's control of Manchuria was a disaster for China. Japanese aggression caused nationalists to promote a massive boycott of Japanese goods. The nationalists focused on the Japanese threat and neglected land reform, leaving Chinese peasants in poverty. Peasants were in debt and underfed. The nationalists focused on Japan and also the purging of the communists. They tried to finish off the Chinese communists, but failed. The communists escaped on a 6,000-mile retreat that lasted 12 months. This retreat was called the Long March. By the late 1930s, Japanese ultranationalists and the military were in command of the Japanese government. The Japanese moved against the Chinese nationalists and conquered Beijing and northern China. The Japanese launched attacks throughout the Chinese region and began to commit atrocities against the population. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese were raped or killed in the event known as the Rape of Nanjing. This map shows the Chinese Communist movement and the war with Japan between 1927 and 1938. The French had Indochina as their colony and refused to allow the exportation of liberal policies and civil rights. The heavy-handed French rule stimulated support for the communist factions organized by Ho Chi Minh. The Dutch made some concessions in the East Indies after the First World War, yet they cracked down hard on the nationalist movement and jailed the nationalist leaders in the 1930s. The Philippines attempted to revolt against U.S. rule. When the U.S. economy collapsed in the 1930s, the Philippines became more of a liability, and Congress allowed the Filipino population to move into self-government. That concludes the lecture on Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America.